It's the year 1355, and this is Geoffrey, a shoemaker in London who wakes before dawn to a city already ringing with bells. Londoners told the time by the bells of nearby churches because almost no one owned a clock. Geoffrey is a cordwainer, a maker of brand new shoes from fine leather. And, by the rules he had to follow, he was actually forbidden to repair old shoes because mending was the separate, lower job of the cobbler. The group that made those rules was called a guild, an association of skilled craftsmen that tightly controlled a single trade. And many such guilds, representing different crafts and trades, were woven into the government of the city itself, centered on London's great civic headquarters, the Guildhall, which, by the way, still stands today, though much altered from its medieval form, right in the heart of the historic financial district, among the skyscrapers of the modern city of London. Like most Londoners, he lives above his own workshop and sells straight through the ground floor window onto the street. Home, workshop, and shop were all the same building. London held perhaps 40,000 people, tiny beside ancient Rome, but still, by far the biggest city in England. And it sat inside a stone wall built over what the Romans had built over 1,000 years earlier. In fact, London began as a Roman town called Londinium, back when Britain was part of their empire, remnants of which are still visible today. In fact, within just a decade of Rome conquering Britannia and establishing its northernmost province, Londinium had already become a booming commercial center before the Celtic queen Boudica and her native army destroyed it in a revolt against the Roman invaders. But even then, the city was quickly rebuilt and soon grew into one of the most important settlements in Roman Britain. The night before, a bell had rung curfew, a word from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, an order for everyone to put out or bury their hearth fire for the night, because a crowded city built of timber and straw could burn to the ground in hours. London's streets were extremely narrow, with upper floors sometimes projecting over the streets so far that they almost touched across the road. Such an architectural feature was known as jettying. Land was expensive, so buildings kept a small footprint while their upper floors projected out over the street. But this only worsened the fire hazard. On London's already narrow streets, the overhanging stories brought opposing buildings dangerously close together, making it easier for flames to leap from one side of the street to the other. But why was a French word being used to describe a curfew? Well, because England came to be ruled by those having ancestry with people from Normandy and France, who we call the Normans, who themselves were descendants of Vikings, who had settled in northern France generations earlier. In 1066, their Duke William sailed across, invaded, and made himself King of England, an event known as the Norman Conquest of England, the last successful conquest of England by a foreign power. Now, this was a result of a complex succession crisis, but that is a story for another time. Here's the surprise. The ruling class of England barely spoke any English for centuries. In fact, even in the 14th century, the city ran on 3 languages at once. Ordinary people, or common Anglo-Saxons, spoke English. The royal court and nobles, while by now did speak English, used French extensively, while official and church records were written in Latin. Now back to that curfew, because once it rang, the gates in the city wall were chained shut, and anyone caught on the streets afterward without a lantern and a good reason could be seized by the watch. Ordinary citizens who took nightly turns patrolling their neighborhood, since there was no police force yet. In winter, this rule could be awkward, because the long nights sent people to bed early, and many would naturally stir again in the small hours. In fact, some historians believe medieval people often slept in 2 shifts, waking for a couple of hours in the middle of the night before drifting off again. Getting water was hard labor. Londoners collected it from public fountains or bought it from carriers who lugged it door to door in tubs. Hardly anyone drank that water on its own. Everyone, children included, drank weak ale with every meal because the brewing process made ale far safer than the water sitting in the wells. Bread and ale mattered so much that the king's law fixed their prices, setting out exactly how large a loaf had to be for the money paid. A baker caught selling loaves that were too small faced harsh penalties. And to avoid slipping up, even by accident, bakers began adding a free 13th loaf to every 12, which is where we get the phrase, baker's dozen. Dozen means 12, baker's dozen means 13. Now, back to that dirty water, because rubbish was a daily battle. There were no sewers, so waste went into the river or straight onto the road. The city hired men called rakers to cart that away. Today, though, is a huge day for the family because Geoffrey's 21-year-old son Adam is about to become a free man of the City of London. Adam had spent 7 years as an apprentice, a live-in trainee, bound by a signed contract called an indenture, who worked for a master craftsman in return for food, a bed, and a full training in the craft, but no wages. Becoming a free man was basically London's version of citizenship. Only a free man could do business freely inside London's walls. Everyone else was called a foreigner, and oddly, that included Englishmen just outside London who had to pay extra just to sell within its walls. Paying one large sum outright was, in fact, another way to become a free man. Adam earned his through his guild, the cordwainers, and guilds did far more than train workers. They set quality standards, settled arguments, and looked after those who fell sick. The leaders of the wealthiest guilds helped elect the Lord Mayor, the head of the city. By the way, London had been allowed to run much of its own affairs for a very long time. When the Normans conquered England, they granted the city a charter, a written promise letting Londoners the right to govern themselves. Now, talking about the Normans, because of their legacy, England's current rulers, known as the Plantagenets, still hold ties and lands in France. The French crown resented that an English king controlled its territory and wanted it back. As a result, the two kingdoms would clash for decades. Funding those wars meant heavy taxes, and England's nobles eventually grew so fed up that they forced their king to sign a written agreement called Magna Carta, a charter limiting the king's power. It would become the distant beginning of a parliament, laying the foundation for the parliamentary monarchy England still follows today. But that old rivalry with France never faded. In 1337, it erupted into a series of wars that dragged on for years, until the fighting paused in 1348. That too, unwillingly. Europe had been overwhelmed by the most devastating pandemic in recorded history, the Black Plague, a bacterial disease that swept the continent and cut its population by up to half. And this very morning, Geoffrey had heard unsettling news in the market. With the plague now past, the king had authorized a fresh campaign across the sea against the French. It would become part of the long conflict later known as the 100 Years' War. The same war that would give rise to figures like Joan of Arc, who helped lead France to victory. But today, Geoffrey has other things on his plate. Because this morning, Adam stands before the city's officials and swears an oath to follow London's rules. His name is written into the official roll of freemen, and with those few words, he finally gains what the last 7 years were for: the right to trade, to belong, and to call himself a full Londoner. Walking home, the family crosses London Bridge. Unlike its plain, utilitarian look today, back then it wasn't just a bridge, but a bustling street. lined with shops and tall houses, even a church built out over the water. It even had a water wheel that used the Thames itself to power a mill and grind grain. Below, the river was crowded with small boats, and watermen ferried passengers from bank to bank because London Bridge was the only crossing in the entire city. Tower Bridge, which many today mistake for it, wouldn't exist for more than 500 years. They passed through Cheapside, London's main market street, where goldsmiths and cloth sellers laid out their wares. Cheap, by the way, comes from an Old English word meaning trade. They then visit St. Paul's Cathedral, which would go on to become the heart of London's religious and civic life today. That evening, the family eats far better than usual, and Adam sits among the grown craftsmen for the first time, no longer a boy training in another man's house, but a full member of his guild, his city, and a London that had just written his name down as one of its own.